Okay, here's a super fun rock painting activity to do with your kiddos or grandkiddos or just by yourself. And this requires zero experience and super simple supplies. So you'll get really pretty painted rocks that you can place around your garden or in your potted plants or even on a windowsill just to look at. And I'm going to give you super easy techniques to get some beautiful painted rocks. Okay, let's talk supplies. You'll need an old box with a piece of plastic or a trash bag, something with an edge around to help keep the paint from going everywhere. I recommend also plastic on the table or newspaper or something, which I didn't have and should have, and things got really messy. An old baking sheet would work too, and you'll need double this for the drying area, so another box and piece of plastic for the drying area. Okay, and plastic disposable gloves are a good idea, and it's good to have paper towels and water on hand for messes. I like these plastic Dixie cups. They're about 3 ounces. I like the smaller ones because it means there's less plastic for the rock to stick to and dry. And then some popsicle sticks. These are good for scooping up your rocks to move to the drying area and for swirling your paint if you want to. Next up is paint. Okay, so these are acrylics, but not just your average acrylics. These are specifically pour paints, pouring acrylics. Different brands call them different things like pouring paint or ready mixed or pre-mixed pouring paint, all these different names. So what we're doing today falls under the category of fluid art or pour painting. You'll find a lot out there if you YouTube this. Basically, these types of paints are more fluid than your standard acrylics, which means they flow and create layers and beautiful different looks. I highly recommend pour painting as a hobby. I mix my own pour paints, but for purposes of this video, I bought the pre-mixed pour paints. This is one of Michael's brands, Craft Smart, and you can find this in the craft paint section. And they sell these versions in sets. Like I said, I mix my own paints usually so I have the flexibility in color combination, but for this video I wanted to keep it simple. So I picked the set called Galaxy because my general color theory with pour painting is that you want a very light and a dark and some other medium or pop color. You want a lot of contrast if you can. And keeping it down to 3 or 4 colors is a good idea. So this Galaxy color set kind of fit all of those. It had a really dark blue, a very light pink, and this magenta I loved, and then a medium blue. The magenta ended up being my favorite color for this one, so sure enough, I ran out of it really quick. Anyways, that's the paint. And then of course you'll need some rocks. I bought big bags of beach pebbles from the hardware store. And make sure to wipe your rocks down to make sure they're free of dirt or grime or anything like that. There's one extra product you have the option to get, and that's 100% silicone oil. Michael sells it in the fine art section by the acrylic paints. I'll put a link in my description to these paints in the silicone. My bottle is covered in paint, otherwise I'd show you the label. The silicone oil is definitely not necessary to paint or to make beautiful pour painting rocks, but it is fun to experiment with if you're curious about it. Okay, now for the fun part. Open up the paints and let's get to it. So we're starting off with a little cup. We're going to squeeze a little of each paint into the cup. So my son is helping me with this project. He loves to paint. These squeeze bottles are kind of tough to squeeze, so help your kiddo out if they need it. I recommend starting out with a small amount of paint to get a feel for the process, and you don't want to just burn through all of your paints on one rock. We used probably a teaspoon of each color for this first swirl. It wasn't enough for this size rock, so we poured more in the cup and then swirled that on. This technique is what I call a ribbon swirl. It's thin strips of color and your hand is moving in that swirling motion, kind of staying in the center but swirling it around. Okay, so for this one, I didn't like that the magenta wasn't showing up, so I poured more in the cup, more magenta in my blues in the cup to try to add a little more magenta. Then I swirled that on. And you see here there's a lot of runoff. These are very fluid paints, so that's just going to happen. I like to see if I can get a pretty rock by using the leftover puddle of paint here. So I call this technique the dump and scoop. I'm going to move this rock off first. I just use the popsicle sticks to slide under the rock to grab it. If you grab the rock with your hands, it's just going to smear all the pretty layers. Okay, so the dump and scoop. Pretty self-explanatory. My son dumps the rock into the puddle, and I scoop up the paint onto the rock. So I'm kind of rotating it upwards as I go along. And then I also start to rotate it onto the sides to make sure I get the whole rock covered with the paint. And that was a pretty quick technique. I wish I could slow that down for you more because I did that pretty quick. I'll show you more examples. I use the dump and scoop technique a lot because if your rock just doesn't look pretty, try out the dump and scoop and just see what you get. It doesn't always work, but the super nice thing about painting rocks is that you can just keep trying on the same rock if it doesn't turn out. So here we squeeze new paint onto the puddle to see if that gets us something pretty with a dump and scoop. It's fine, but I just wanted to try again, and the second time was all one mushy color basically, and that can definitely happen if you smear the rock around too much in the paint. So then I pour paint directly on the rock and then smear it, and that does not help. Okay, so I'm just going to do my third technique here, the ribbon pour. I call it ribbon pour because of the thin strips of color. They look like ribbons. It's just like the swirl ribbon on the first one, except you move the cup sideways along the rock instead of in a swirl, so you're keeping those lines very linear. This one was really pretty, but then I dropped it. So that was super fun. After all, these are super slippery rocks considering they're covered in paint. So I'm trying to carefully balance with popsicle sticks over to set it on a Dixie cup. So it just slipped right off. It's a good lesson for myself to slow down when handling these painted rocks. But again, it's just totally fine. I brought it around to do just another dump and swipe, and I actually ended up liking it. So it all worked out. So no sweat if you drop one or you smear one. You can always just try again. Here's another ribbon pour. I like to smear paint on the rock as a base coat to make sure I get good coverage and flow of the paint that I'm pouring on. And this ribbon pour turned out good. I'm happy. So here's a ribbon pour, but in my opinion, not enough magenta, so not enough contrast, I feel like. I was beginning to realize since I like magenta so much, I need 2 times as much of it as I do the other colors. And since the set came with a dark and medium blue, that's a lot of blue, and not a lot of contrast between those two. So more magenta and the light pink, and I loved this one. But then I dropped it. Slippery rocks. That's okay. I'm just going to dump and swipe, and it came to the rescue. I ended up liking this one too. So I'm going to give that same ribbon pour a try, the one with the heavier on the magenta and light pink, and I really like how it turns out. Okay, so one last technique called the flip cup. So pour your colors in the cup, then take a popsicle stick and give it 2 to 3 kind of diagonal stirs, almost like you're writing an X in the cup. Then you flip it onto the rock to dump all the paint onto the rock, and I try to move my cup off of it quickly so that I'm not just dripping globs of paint onto it. And this is also a technique that you can do with the silicone in your cup also. This is where you can get experimental with it. So 1 to 2 drops total in the cup. This will give you what we call cells, and these are like circular cell-like shapes. But they are tricky. Cells are tricky because they tend not to hold unless on a level surface. And the rocks are not traditionally a level surface. So that's why I'm not doing a straight tutorial on using a silicone, is because it's just kind of an experiment to see if the cells will stay on your rock. So like I said, it's not necessary, but it is fun to try. And so that's it. Those are my techniques. I let them all drip dry on the cups. Definitely cover them up for several hours to dry. You want to cover them so bugs and leaves and stuff don't blow in the wind and get stuck on your rocks and then dry that way. Also be careful whenever you're covering them up, because I definitely smeared paint off of one of those ribbon pours that I really loved, and I was like, rats again. So just a really good learning experience for me. Also, you want to cover them up because if they get rained on, they'll just get ruined. So let them dry for several hours depending on your humidity. I regularly check them. What I'm looking for is dry on top so I can pick them up by the edges, and the bottoms will still have some goopy paint, and then I use a baby wipe or paper towel to wipe off the bottom paint. I like to show the bare rock on the bottom, but you can certainly let yours dry entirely with the paint on. It's up to you. So if you get any dried rings on the bottom from the cup, where it said on the cup, you can just use sandpaper to smooth it down. Then I definitely recommend sealing them after a full day of drying. I just use Rust-Oleum Ultra Cover Clear Gloss Spray. I used fine thin layers, and they hold up to moisture pretty well. You want to seal them because rocks are a slick surface and the acrylic doesn't have much to adhere to. Like there's no grit on the rock for the paint to really cling to. So if the dried acrylic gets wet, it risks just like soaking and peeling off the rock. So especially seal the rocks if you're putting these outside or in a potted plant that will be watered. If this was fun or helpful, please click the like button. If you're interested in seeing how I make other pour paintings, I will link a playlist of all my pour painting time-lapse videos in the description. Thanks bunches for watching!